When we got done with our Bible class, I was wore out. I was trying to explain Hebrews chapter 7. I thought I was drowning, and the harder I tried, it seemed to get worse and worse. I thought I was losing everybody, and I was so glad when that class was over. And then after it was over, I had a lot of people tell me they could understand Hebrews 7 better than they thought they ever had before. So I guess nobody, you didn't drown as bad as I thought. Sometimes it sure does feel that way, though. Yeah. Oh, did I leave it on? Thanks, Roy. I'd like to review this just a little bit because it is a bit unusual for most of us. Melchizedek, I want to make sure we understand him. The Hebrews author, well, not him, but actually the Lord was very upset with the Hebrews because they didn't understand who Melchizedek was, and I'd like to make sure he's not upset with us because we don't know who he is. But this Melchizedek, there's a lot said about him in the Hebrew letter. But one of the most important statements made, in my estimation, is the fact that he was made like the Son of God. You don't want to lose sight of that. Even though he was in the world 2,000 years before Christ was, he was made like the Son of God. He was made to appear as Jesus would appear when Jesus came into the world. 2,000 years ahead of time, God set this prototype before the world to give people an idea that a priest was coming that was greater than the priests of the Levitical system. He wanted his people to know that there was a greater hope coming. And Melchizedek is one of the ways he did that. We're told he's without mother or father, beginning or end. That's not literally true. It appears to be true from the biblical point of view, but he had a mom and daddy, and whether he had children or not, I don't know. Whether he was the one and only priest, high priest of God, I don't know. Whether he was the one and only king of Salem, I don't know. I tend to doubt that one. There was probably a king after him. But whether or not there was ever another high priest appointed, that's something we won't know the answer to. At least not till Aaron was made high priest. But it looks, when you read the scriptures, it looks like Melchizedek comes from nowhere, goes nowhere. He is made like unto the Son of God. The Son of God, of course, was unique in his own right, without beginning or end, and therefore Melchizedek was made to look the same way. But we know he had a mother and father, and that he died because that's the fate of all people. This Melchizedek, he blessed Abraham, and Abraham gave tithes to him, thus indicating that Melchizedek is greater than Abraham. All the Jews look up to Abraham. We look up to Abraham. He's the father of all of us. He is the one that God gave the promise to of a Savior, redemption, atonement, and ultimately eternal life. He was greater than this great patriarch Abraham, and the author indicates that by the fact that he blessed him and that Abraham gave tithes to him. Now, he goes on to point out that in the loins of Abraham, at the time he was blessed by Melchizedek, at the time Abraham paid tithes to him, in his loins were Isaac, Jacob, and Levi. These were the descendants that would come from him that would inherit the promises. Therefore, in a sense, they were blessed by Melchizedek. In a sense, they paid tithes to Melchizedek. Melchizedek was greater than Abraham. He was also greater than these men. From the tribe of Levi came Aaron, Israel's first high priest. After him, his son would take his place. Then his son's son, his son's son, and his son's son. It was supposed to go that way all the way down till ultimately the system came to an end. This means that Melchizedek was above the Levitical system. He was greater than Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Levi, Aaron, his sons. As a matter of fact, the entire Levitical priesthood system. The priesthood of Melchizedek was superior to all of it. Now, his argument continues. Jesus is a priest like Melchizedek, not like Aaron, but like Melchizedek. Therefore, Jesus is greater Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Levi, Aaron, and the Levitical system. Jesus' priesthood is a greater priesthood than the Levitical system. And because Melchizedek was made like the Son of God, since he is the shadow, the Son of God is the true image, that would mean that Jesus is also greater than this man Melchizedek. He's superior to all of them. And that's what the author argues in this chapter, is that Jesus has a better priesthood. Jesus has a greater promise that goes along with his priesthood. He's doing this because those who abandon Jesus are going back to the Levitical system. They're going from the greater to the lesser. And why would you do that? Now, a lot of Jews in the first century, they were going back to the Levitical system predominantly to justify circumcision. You have to be circumcised. Why? Because it's commanded in the law of Moses. They weren't going back necessarily to keep the entirety of the law, but certain elements of the law. There were some people that were going back to the law altogether. They were abandoning Christianity. But there were some who were just trying to merge the two together and make peace between the Jews and the Christians. But the thing about it is, when you go from Jesus back to the Levitical system, you can do that by any one thing. One of the things that people go back to the Levitical system for today is mechanical music. They go back to the Psalms, to David, and we can have music in the church today because they had music in the church today. According to the Hebrews author, in James chapter 2, in verse 10, if you go back to any point of the law, you're convicted to keep the entirety of the law. In other words, you can't go back and say, we're going to use mechanical music because we find it in the Old Testament. According to James, when you go back to the law and say, we're going to use mechanical music, you're obligated to keep the entire law. You've got to keep all of it. Because if you offend in any one point, you become guilty of all of it. Anytime we leave Jesus and we go back to the old system for justification of anything, we become guilty of leaving the priesthood of Christ and going back to the Levitical system because the law rests on the priesthood. And he'll make that argument in our lesson this morning. I hope you all understand that. Have you got any questions about it? Yeah. Yeah, 500 years. He could be what? Well, he was made high priest because God made him high priest. Well, first of all, Melchizedek was a Gentile. He wasn't a Hebrew. He had nothing to do with the Hebrews. There was no kinship between him and Abraham. No, he was a Hebrew. He was a Hebrew during his lifetime. That's what the people called him. The word Hebrew means from beyond. Abraham came from the Ur of the Chaldeans, from beyond the Euphrates River. So when he came into Canaan land as a stranger, moving into the neighborhood, and there goes the neighborhood, they said, you know that Hebrew over there? Well, what they meant was that guy who came from beyond the Euphrates. That's what the Hebrew meant. But he was called Hebrew during his lifetime. It was a tag that he had, and it was a tag that stuck to his people down through the years. He was named that by his neighbors, not by God. Yeah. Well, Israel is the name of Jacob, and they took his name. It was the sons or the tribes of Jacob. That's how you would refer to it, or you call it the sons of the tribes of Israel, and in time they just shortened it to Israel. But they just bore the name of their father. That's where the national name came from. But one of the things you got is this Melchizedek. If there wasn't that blurb in the book of Genesis and also the 110th Psalm, if you didn't have those two blurbs, we wouldn't know anything about Melchizedek. But he still would have been a high priest. Just because we didn't know he was high priest doesn't mean he wasn't high priest. If we had no record, he would still have been the high priest of God. And the question becomes this: how many high priests did God appoint? No. What? Abraham recognized himself as being subservient to Melchizedek. He realized that. So this goes beyond the tribal systems. Okay, it wasn't just because he was the head of the house of his tribe. He was appointed a high priest in the sense that Abraham recognized him as being his greater. Now, how that system worked, I have no idea. The Bible doesn't tell us. But we do know there was a system. There had to have been one. Higher than the family, yeah. There had to be at that time. Because Melchizedek is recognized. Otherwise, Abraham wouldn't have recognized him, being of a different tribe. So there was something there we don't know about. God made Melchizedek a high priest, and apparently people from various tribes recognized him as a high priest. I don't know how it worked. I know it did work. But for all I know, there could have been 100 such people that was appointed through the years. Maybe. I don't know. That's the thing we don't know. Probably, I would venture to guess, and it's only a guess, that the answer to that question would be no. And the reason being that the Gentile world had become so immoral, so sinful, so godless, that I don't know that there would have been any entity large enough to warrant something like that. Were there saved people among the Gentiles during those years? I'm sure there were. Was there a high priest appointed during those years? I don't know that. Personally, I don't think there probably was. But during the earlier days, there could have been. Because this Melchizedek, he just bops out of nowhere. And all of a sudden, Abraham recognizes him as his high priest. You know, you can't overlook that fact, that Abraham knew that and recognized him as such. One of the points I was wanting to make right there is we don't know hardly anything about the time period. We know so little. Even during the Old Testament period, we know so little about what went on. The scriptures, they focus on Israel because the purpose of the scriptures is tracing the lineage of the Christ. Okay, we're watching God develop things over a period of time until finally Jesus comes into the world. Therefore, the divine camera is focused on Israel. Okay, that's what it looks at. Not interested in Gentiles because that's got nothing to do with it. Just looking here at Israel. So all the other things going on in the world, we have no idea what they were. But we do know that there were people, good people, godly people among the Gentiles. We do know that they had a law that they lived by. We do know that they could be saved if they lived in harmony with their conscience. And however that system of law worked, I don't know. But we have almost no information about all that stuff. Well, I'm talking about the Old Testament period. Well, like the Book of Genesis and all that, that was written around 1500 BC, about 2,500 years after the creation or after the fact. Moses wrote about things that happened in the past. But, oh yeah, we have what we need in order to know the God, be able to believe, and ultimately be saved. But there is so much we don't know. Yeah, and the problem is sometimes we think things happened a specific way, a certain way, and yet we can't prove that. In our minds, Adam and Eve had Cain, Abel, and Seth. Bang, bang, bang. Is that true? I mean, did they have a girl first? Did they have Lisa, Marie, and Tanya before Cain was born? I don't know. How many children did Mother Eve have? She probably lived to be 900. She would have 900 kids. I don't know. There's so much I don't know. How long did they live in the Garden of Eden? I don't know. We read the book of Genesis, and here they are. They're created, and then on the same day they committed sin, and on the same day they get kicked out of the garden. That's the way we read it because that's the way it's recorded. But for all I know, they could have lived in the Garden of Eden for 100 years before God allowed the serpent to come into the garden. Okay? There's so much we don't know. And we tend to say things that aren't necessarily true. It's like the flood. In my mind, I always imagined the water over a period of time finally, ever so slowly, lifting that boat up off the ground. And then as time went on, the water came up along the sides after day after day after day. The water came up until finally the thing started floating. People were trying to get into the ark and all that stuff. But scientific exploration has demonstrated to us that the flood, when it happened, it was so brutal that all that probably happened in a moment of time almost. Because animals were actually encapsulated in ice while they were chewing their cud. And they found creatures, the woolly mammoth up north, that still have green grass in their mouth where they were trapped. And that was all during the time of the flood. So the vision I always had about the flood, about the boat coming up ever so slowly, is probably totally wrong. It probably happened really, really, really fast. And it was very, very violent, more violent than we could probably imagine. The springs of the earth opened, the canopy above fell. I mean, so many things were going on simultaneously. So much water hit the earth at one time that we really can't even imagine what it was like. But my whole vision of what happened was wrong. I've gotten to the point where I don't speculate too much on what's not said, because I'm usually wrong when I do that. But it's easy to do, so easy to do, because of the brevity of the scriptures. They're so brief, and there's so much we'd like to know. Yeah, and probably are about a lot of stuff. Of course, that's not going to be fatal. It's not a matter of doctrine. There's a difference between error and a fatal error. If we knew all of our errors, we'd probably be shocked. But just because we're wrong about things doesn't necessarily make it a fatal error. There's things we misunderstand. It just doesn't matter. And there's things we might misunderstand that it really matters. For example, being saved, we are to know what we are to do to be saved. Misunderstanding baptism is a fatal error, but my not understanding the background of the Gentile priesthood, uh, uh, any errors I might make are not going to be fatal unless I pervert the divine record. Then of course it would be. But Melchizedek, he's an oddity. He really makes me scratch my head. He's an interesting character, but God made him special, just so the Hebrew author could pen this letter one day and use him as an example of Jesus Christ. He thinks a long time into the future. Again, we see the providence of God in all that. God was setting the stage during the days of Abraham. He was setting the stage for Jesus to come into the world 2,000 years later. For all I know, God was doing things 2,000 years ago, preparing me for this world. You don't know. Providence is it's too wonderful to fathom. Yeah, well, providence is an amazing and wonderful subject. People they stand in awe of miracles. The miracles don't impress me as much as providence does. God created the heavens and the earth. Okay, I understand, I know, and I believe that. God could raise the dead back to life. Well, I don't see that as such a big deal. After he created the heavens and all the creation, raising one person back to life doesn't seem like a big deal to me for my God. I mean, look at what he's already done. That doesn't seem that hard. But providence, the way things move through providence, now that's one that'll really make you stay up late, trying to walk through it with the scriptures and see how things unfold. Yeah. Yeah, well, we can understand it, but we can't grasp it. It's like God, he is the eternal one. I know that. I understand what it means, but for me to really grasp it, I still don't. You know, he has no beginning. That just, I'm going to scratch my head till I get to see him one day. Something without a beginning is, I keep coming back. Well, somewhere, sometime you had to start, but he has no beginning, and he has no end. And we were created with a beginning, but we have no end. It's a magnificent thing to entertain, but to say that I've ever really wrapped my mind around it, I couldn't say that. I haven't wrapped my mind around eternity. I believe it, but I can't grasp it, not in its total sense. Uh, I, one thing about Bible study over the years, I've been doing this for about 40 years, I guess. The more I learn, the more I realize how little I understand. The dumber I get. How about that? The more I learn, the dumber I become. I realize my ignorance uh, as I learn. It sounds weird, but it's actually true. I realize how little I do know, and it's very little. It's very little. Anyway, they shouldn't go back to the priesthood of Levi because they're going from the lesser to the greater. Jesus is superior to all of them, and that's the point he wants to make. Jesus' priesthood is the greatest priesthood of all, and that's important because the high priest stood between them and God. He was their mediator. We need to read 11 through 28. We'll do this rather quickly. Therefore, if perfection were through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should rise according to the order of Melchizedek, and not be called according to the order of Aaron? For the priesthood being changed of necessity, there is also a change of the law. For he of whom these things are spoken belongs to another tribe, from which no man has officiated at the altar. It is evident that our Lord arose from Judah, of which tribe Moses spoke nothing concerning priesthood. And it is yet far more evident if, in the likeness of Melchizedek, there arises another priest who has come, not according to the law of a fleshly commandment, but according to the power of an endless life. For he testifies, you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. For on the one hand, there is an annulling of the former commandment because of its weakness and unprofitableness, for the law made nothing perfect. On the other hand, there is the bringing in of a better hope, through which we draw near to God. And inasmuch as he was not made priest without an oath, for they have become priests without an oath, but he with an oath, by him who said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not relent, you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. That comes from Psalm 110, verse 4. By so much more, Jesus has become a surety of a better covenant. Also, there were many priests, because they were prevented by death from continuing. But he, because he continues forever, has an unchangeable priesthood. Therefore, he is also able to save to the uttermost those who come to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. For such a high priest was fitting for us, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and has become higher than the heavens, who does not need daily, as those high priests, to offer up sacrifices, first for his own sins, then for the people's. For this he did once for all, when he offered up himself. For the law appoints as high priests men who have weakness, but the word of the oath which came after the law appoints the Son, who has been perfected forever. Now let's analyze it. Verse 11, therefore, if perfection were through the Levitical priesthood, for under the Levitical priesthood the people received the law. What further need was there that another priest should rise according to the order of Melchizedek and not be called according to the order of Aaron? If men were made perfect by the Levitical system, he asks, why would God forecast, prophesy another priest besides the Aaronic priesthood? Why would he do that? If the law could make people perfect because the law rests on the priesthood, if the Levitical priests, the system, could make men perfect, why would God appoint another law or another priest? And that's what David declared in the 110th Psalm in verse 4, that God would raise up a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Well, why would he do that if perfection were under the Levitical system? Why wouldn't it just continue under the Levitical system? The conclusion is irresistible. Men aren't made perfect under the Levitical system. It doesn't work. Another priest implied the Aaronic priesthood was imperfect. That's the point he's making there. For the priesthood being changed from Levi to the Christian, of necessity there is also a change of the law. Notice the words of necessity. When the priesthood changed, it was necessary that the law must change also. And there's a good reason for that. Much of the law pertains to the priesthood. For example, the book of Leviticus. The entire book is giving the priests instruction. But if the priesthood is done away with, what's the value of the book of Leviticus? All those laws would be non-essential. There's a lot of the law that pertains to the priesthood. If the priesthood changes to another priesthood, the law has to change so that the laws of the new priesthood could be implemented. And that's what he's saying. And that, of course, is what all the Jews would know. If you change the priesthood, you're going to have to change the law. That's just the way it goes by necessity. For he, that's Jesus, he of whom these things are spoken belongs to another tribe from which no man has officiated at the altar. Jesus came out of the tribe, well, he'll say that. It is evident that our Lord arose from Judah. He come out of the tribe of Judah, And there's never been a man out of the tribe of Judah that ever officiated at the altar. Why? This is the tribe Moses spoke nothing concerning priesthood. The tribe of Judah would bring forth kings. The kings of Israel would come out of the tribe of Judah. I believe it's back in Genesis chapter 49 where Jacob prophesied to his sons, especially to Judah. He said that the scepter shall never depart from Judah. Judah would be the kingly tribe amongst the tribes of Israel. She would produce the kings. But when it comes to priests, Moses spoke nothing. That's what he's underscoring. No, Moses spoke nothing about a priest coming out of the tribe of Judah. Now there's a law that all men are governed or must live by, Colossians 3:17. Whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord. That law was existed. Well, it existed in the days of Adam and Eve. It's always been the case that whatever a person did in word or deed, they must do in the name of the Lord. It's stated in Colossians 3:17, but it's an eternal law. It's always been that way. And therefore, since Moses spoke nothing about priests coming out of the tribe of Judah, it would be wrong for priests to come out of the tribe of Judah. Because if you brought a priest out of the tribe of Judah, you're not doing it in the name of the Lord. Because the Lord said nothing about it. He's silent on the matter. And because God is silent about this matter, you can't have a priest come out of the tribe of Judah. And this is his argument. That's why he uses those words. Jesus came from Judah, of which tribe Moses spoke nothing concerning priesthood. Therefore, Jesus could not be a priest while he was on this earth. He would have sinned if he had become a priest. He just couldn't do it. There had to be a new priesthood established before he could be priest. And it is yet far more evident if, in the likeness of Melchizedek, there arises another priest. You got to change the priesthood so Jesus can be high priest, who has come, not according to the law of a fleshly commandment, the law of Moses. The law of Moses appoints the high priest under the Levitical system. Not that way. He was made high priest according to the power of an endless life. He is without beginning and without end. For he testifies in Psalm 110 and verse 4, God does, you are a priest forever, without end, according to the order of Melchizedek, or as Melchizedek was. You had to have a new priest, and when you appoint a new priest, you've got to have a new law. If Jesus' priesthood is superior to the Levitical priesthood, then Jesus' law is superior to Moses' law. Why would you want to go from the greater back to the lesser? The former system couldn't save you. Jesus' system can save you. Why would you leave a system that could save you and go back to a system that can't save you? It's just not rational or reasonable. On the one hand, there is an annulling of the former commandment. It's because of its weakness and its unprofitableness. It was annulled because the law made nothing perfect. The word annul there means abolish. The law was abolished. Why? Because it was weak. It was unprofitable. It made nothing perfect. No one could be saved by law. You couldn't be saved by law before Christ came into this world. You can't be saved by law after Christ came into this world. Law doesn't save people. Law is a rule of conduct. You can't be saved by law keeping. It's simply not possible. Therefore, he says, the law made nothing perfect, and therefore the law of Moses had to be taken out of the way so that a perfect system could be established. To be made perfect, be made whole, or sinless is the meaning of that. On the other hand, there is the bringing in of a better hope. And that, of course, is grace and truth. through which we draw near to God. Through Jesus Christ, we do what we couldn't do by the law of Moses. We get nearer to God. He gives us access to God, not because we're good at keeping laws, but by grace we're saved. Not from what we do, but by grace we're saved. He chooses to save us, and that's how we're saved. That's how people before the cross were saved. It wasn't by the law of Moses, it was by grace. That's how we are saved today. It's not by the law of Christ, it's by grace. So the $64 question becomes, who does the Lord extend his grace to? Well, he tells us it's those who believe, Hebrews 11 and 6, and those who will obey him, back to Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 9. If we believe him, if we obey him, he'll give his grace to us, and by the grace we're being saved. He gives grace to those who believe and obey. So it's salvation by grace, not salvation by law keeping. That's why a new system had to be established. That's why we had to have a new high priest. Jesus does for us what Aaron could never have done. He can give us access to God the Father through his blood. And this is as much as he was not made priest without an oath. Verse 21, they become priests without an oath. They become priests because they're descendants of Aaron. When the high priest dies, one of his descendants is appointed high priest. There's no oath from God. On the other hand, the Lord has sworn and will not relent regarding the Christ that he would be a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. They're appointed high priest without an oath from God. Jesus is appointed high priest with an oath from God. And by so much more, Jesus has become surety of a better covenant. It's a better covenant that we live by. The word covenant means a contractual agreement, and that's the agreement we live under. By faith and obedience, we are saved by the grace of God. That's the covenant we live under, sealed and ratified by the blood of God's own Son. It's a better covenant than the covenant that existed before Christ, a better covenant than the Mosaic covenant, because the Mosaic covenant could not give salvation. Christ, on the other hand, can. Therefore, it's a better covenant. So why would you go from the better covenant to the lesser covenant? The covenant that offers salvation to the covenant that doesn't offer salvation. Over and over and over again, he's arguing to his Jewish brethren, you don't want to go back to the law of Moses. It's not the right direction. Also, there were many priests because they were prevented by death from continuing. A priest would die, and another priest would have to be appointed. He would die, another priest would have to be appointed, so on and so forth. But Jesus, because he continues forever, he has an unchangeable priesthood. You and I have the same high priest that Peter had, that Paul had. This never happened before. Jesus lived under the priesthood. The high priest he lived under wasn't Aaron, that people lived under 1,500 years earlier. It wasn't him. It was a different high priest that he lived under. We live under the same high priest because he's been serving as high priest for 2,000 years. He doesn't change as men are wont to change. Therefore, because he continues forever, he is also able to save to the uttermost those who come to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. For such a high priest was fitting for us, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and has become higher than heavens. Men, the best of men, have their own weaknesses and shortcomings. Our high priest does not. I better stop. I wanted to get done with verse 28, but I don't think we'll make it. Race.